Intriguing question. Imagine an artifact so powerful, it could twist the noblest hearts and enslave entire civilizations. What if I told you this wasn't just a tale, but a profound exploration into the very essence of corruption? Journey with us as we uncover the origins of the One Ring, born in the fiery depths of Mount Doom, and witness its chilling power to ensnare minds and warp destinies across Middle-earth. A tale that spans thousands of years, that reaches from the depths of the earth to the heights of the heavens, that touches the lives of elves and dwarves and men and creatures both fair and terrible. Tonight, I shall tell you of the Rings of Power. You have heard the name, I am certain. Who has not? In these latter days, the One Ring has become the stuff of legend, the dark treasure that nearly brought ruin to all the free peoples of Middle-earth. But the One Ring was not alone. It was not even the first. Before it there were others, many others, and their story is far older and far more complex than most realize. So close your eyes if you wish. Let the warmth of the fire wash over you. Let my voice carry you back through the long ages of this world, to a time when the shadow of Morgoth had fallen, when Sauron walked the earth in fair disguise, and when the greatest smiths in all of history bent their skills to a task that changed the fate of Middle-earth forever. Let us begin at the beginning, or at least at that part of beginning that concerns our tale most directly. In the year 1200 of the Second Age, nearly 2,000 years after the fall of Morgoth and the breaking of Beleriand, a stranger came to the elven realm of Lindon. He was fair of face, wise of speech, and generous with his knowledge. He called himself Anatar, which in the elven tongue means Lord of Gifts, and he claimed to have been sent by the Valathams, the elves selves, to aid healing the hurts of the world. Now, you must understand what those days were like for the elves of Middle-earth. They had survived the terrible wars against Morgoth, had witnessed the drowning of their ancient homeland in Beleriand, and had established new realms in the lands that remained. But they were wary, these ancient peoples. They had seen too much death, too much destruction, too much loss. The world they loved was fading around them, and they felt powerless to stop it. For the elves, you see, are immortal in a fashion that differs greatly from the way men understand immortality. They do not die of old age, true, but neither are they unchanging. An elf grows weary with the passage of ages, grows heavy with memory, grows tired of a world that changes around them while they remain the same. And the things they love, the things they create, the lands they tend and the gardens they cultivate, all these things fade and pass away, leaving the elves ever more sorrowful for their loss. This was the great burden of the elder in those days. They watched the world grow old around them, watched their works crumble and decay, watched the beauty they had labored so hard to create slip away like sand through their fingers. And they longed for some way to preserve what they loved, to hold back the tide of time, to keep the world young and fair forever. Into this longing came Anatar with his promises and his gifts. He did not go first to the great lords of the Eldar. Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor Lindon, would not receive him. The king's heart misgave him, and he sensed something false beneath the fair exterior. Aron too was suspicious, for he had learned wisdom from many sources, and his heart told him that this stranger was not what he claimed to be. And Galadriel, wisest of the elven women, looked upon Anatar with eyes that seemed to pierce his disguise, and she counseled strongly against trusting him. But the smiths of a region were more receptive. A region was a realm of the Noldor, founded by elves who had come to Middle-earth in ages past, seeking the Silmarils, those great jewels that had caused so much grief and glory. These were craftsmen of surpassing skill, descended from those who had learned their trade from all the smith himself in the blessed realm. And their lord was Celebrimbor, grandson of Ephraim, heir to the greatest tradition of craftsmanship the world had ever known. Celebrimbor was not evil, nor was he foolish in the ordinary sense. He was simply driven by the same passion that had consumed his grandfather, the desire to create works of surpassing beauty and power. And when Anatar came to him with knowledge of techniques the elves had never mastered, with secrets of metallurgy and enchantment that seemed to offer solutions to the problems that plagued the Eldar, Celebrimbor listened. For nearly 300 years, they worked together. Anatar and the smiths of a region. They exchanged knowledge, they experimented with new techniques, they pushed the boundaries of what elven craft could achieve. And gradually, through long study and careful experimentation, they discovered how to make rings of power. The lesser rings came first, words of great beauty but limited strength. Experiments in the art of ring making that taught the smiths much about what was possible. These rings had power, yes, but not the sort of power that could reshape the fate of nations. They were learning exercises, stepping stones on the path to greater achievements. But Anatar was patient. He guided the smiths along that path, step by careful step, always pushing them toward greater and greater works. And at last, around the year 5000 the Second Age, the great work began. The Rings of Power. 16 rings were forged in the fires of a region during those years of intense labor. 16 bands of gold and silver and other precious metals, each imbued with powers beyond the understanding of ordinary folk. These were not mere trinkets or ornaments. They were vessels of tremendous magical force, capable of enhancing the natural abilities of their bearers to heights previously unimaginable. The 7 were made for the Dwarves, those hardy folk who delved deep into the earth and loved gold above almost all else. The rings given to the dwarves enhanced their natural talents, making them even more skilled at their crafts, even more able to find precious metals and gems in the stone, even more wealthy and powerful than they had been before. The 9 were made for the great lords of men, the kings and warriors and sorcerers who ruled the realms of humanity. These rings granted long life far beyond the mortal span, along with power over minds and the ability to see things hidden from ordinary sight. They were gifts that seemed beyond price, treasures that the lords of men accepted eagerly. But there was a flaw in these rings, a flaw but only become apparent later. They had been made with the aid of Anatar, and into their making he had woven subtle influences, hidden connections, secret pathways that would allow them to be controlled by one who knew how. The rings themselves were not inherently evil, but they were susceptible to domination, vulnerable to the will of one who possessed the key to their power. And then there were the 3. The 3 rings of the elf were different from the others. They were made by Celebrimbor alone, without the direct aid of Anatar, though using the techniques that Anatar had taught. They were the pinnacle of elven ring craft, the most powerful and the most pure of all the rings of power. They were Naria, the ring of fire, ruby red and burning with hidden flame. They were Nenya, the ring of water, white as adamant and cool as starlight on still water. And they were Vilya, the ring of air, blue as the summer sky and filled with the power of wind and weather. These 3 were not tainted by the direct touch of Sauron, for that is who Anatar truly was. Sauron, the greatest of Morgotha's servants to survive the War of Wrath. Sauron, who had hidden himself when his master fell and had waited long centuries in the shadows before emerging to begin his own dominion over Middle-earth. The 3 were made for preservation, for healing, for the protection of all that was good and fair in the world. They embody the highest aspirations of the elves, the desire to preserve beauty and fight against the decay of time. And Celebrimbor, in making them, had hoped to create tools that would help the Eldar maintain their lands and their power against the long-slowed and fading that to claim everything they loved. But even the three were bound by the power of what came next. For Sauron had not taught the elves ring craft out of generosity or friendship. He had done so with a purpose, a dark and terrible purpose that he revealed in the year 600 of the Second Age. In that year, in the fires of Orodruin in land of Mordor, Sauron forged the One Ring. The One Ring. Let me tell you of this terrible thing, this small band of gold that contained more evil than any other object in the history of Middle-earth. It was not large, not outwardly impressive. It was simply a ring of gold, unadorned with gem or carving when cold, though when heated in fire, letters of flame would appear upon its surface. Letters in the black speech of Mordor that spoke its true nature and its true purpose. Into this ring, Sauron poured much of her native power, his strength and his will and his malice. He diminished himself in making it, became lesser than he had been before, but in exchange, he created an artifact of tremendous might, a focus and amplifier for his power that would allow him to dominate all other beings who wore rings touched by his influence. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. That was the inscription upon the ring, and it spoke a terrible truth. The One Ring was designed to dominate all other rings of power, to bend the will of their bearers to Sauron's purposes, to make them slaves and servants of his dark design. Through the One Ring, Sauron could see what the other ring bearers saw, could hear their thoughts, could reach out and touch the minds with his own fell influence. When Sauron first put on the One Ring, the elves perceived it immediately. They felt his mind reaching out to them through rings they wore, felt his dark will pressing against their own, felt the chains of domination that he had woven into the very fabric of the ring to power beginning to tighten around them. And they were horrified. They removed their rings instantly, cast them aside, hid them away in secret places where Sauron could not find them. The three, being the mightiest and the most resistant to his influence, were given to the wisest and most powerful of the Elder, to Gadril, who had seen through Sauron from the beginning. See Redden the Shipwright, oldest of the elves remaining in Middle-earth, and Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor. But for the other rings, it was too late. The 7 had already been given to the lords of the dwarves, and the 9 had already been given to the kings of men. Sauron demanded them back, threatened war if they were not surrendered, and when his demands were refused, war came. The War of the Elves and Sauron began in the year 1693 of the Second Age, and it was a terrible conflict. Sauron's forces swept out of Mordor and fell upon the lands of the elves with fury and malice. The region was destroyed utterly. Celebrimbor was captured, tortured, and slain, his body borne upon a pole as a banner by Sauron's forces. The other rings that Sauron could find were recovered, but the 3 remained hidden, and Sauron could not discover where they had been concealed. The war might have ended with the complete destruction of the elves in Middle-earth, but for the intervention of the Enon-men-Reans. Endor was the great kingdom of men, an island realm in the midst of the sea, closer to the undying lands than to Middle-earth. Its people were the descendants of those who had fought alongside the elves against Morgoth in the First Age, and they had been granted long life and great wisdom as a reward for their faithfulness. In those days, Mena was at the height of its power, and when its king sent a great fleet to the aid of the elves, Sauron was forced to retreat. But he had not been defeated, merely checked. He retreated to Mordor, and there he waited, plotting and scheming, preparing for the next phase of his long campaign. And the rings, the terrible rings, continued the work. Let me tell you what befell the 7 rings of the dwarves. The dwarves were a hardy folk, stubborn and resistant to domination in a way that other races were not. Their minds were strong, their wills were iron, and they had been created by all the smith to endure hardship, and resist the will of Morgoth himself. Sauron found, to his frustration, that he could not enslave the dwarf lords who wore the 7 rings. The rings could not make them invisible, could not turn them to wraiths, could not bend them to serve Sauron's will directly. But the rings were not without effect. They kindled in the hearts of the fourth lords a fierce and burning greed, a hunger for gold and treasure that grew with every passing year. The dwarf rings made their bearers wealthy beyond measure, for they granted the ability to find precious metals and gems that others would overlook, to multiply treasure through means that seemed almost magical. But with that wealth came a possessive madness, a desire to hoard and guard that made the dwarf lords suspicious of all others in their own kin. This greed attracted dragons. One by one, the great dwarf kingdoms fell to dragon fire. The wealth amassed by the ring-bearing lords drew the attention of the great worms, Glorong's children and grandchildren, who descended upon the dwarf halls with fire and ruin. Some of the 7 were consumed in these assaults, melted by the terrible heat of dragon flame. Others were simply lost, buried in the ruins of fallen kingdoms, or taken into hoards where they lay forgotten for ages. In the end, only one of the 7 remained in the possession of the dwarves, passed from king to king in the line of Durin, until even that ring was taken by Sauron himself, during the long years of his renewed power in the Third Age. The 7 had not made the dwarves into servants of Sauron, but they had laid the foundations for the ruin of many dwarf kingdoms, had stirred up the greed that brought the dragons, and contributed to the long, slow decline of dwarven power throughout the ages of Middle-earth. But far worse was the fate of the 9. The 9 rings were given to great lords among men, kings and sorcerers of power and renown. We do not know all of their names, these doomed lords who accepted Sauron's poisoned gifts. 3 were said to be great lords of Menor itself, corrupted by Sauron during the Dark Years, when he was a prisoner in that land. 1 was said to be an Easterling king, ruler of vast realms in the lands beyond the Sea of Run. Others came from the south, from Harad and beyond, lords of peoples who had never known the light of the west. Each of these lords accepted their ring with joy, for the rings granted powers that seemed miraculous. Long life, first and foremost, stretching the mortal span far beyond its natural limits. The ring-bearers did not age as other men aged. They remained strong and vital when their contemporaries grew old and died. They seemed to have cheated death itself, to have stolen a portion of the immortality that belonged by right only to the elder. But immortality is a gift that was not meant for men, and what the rings gave was not true immortality, but something far more terrible. The ring-bearers did not truly cease to age. They simply faded. Year by year, century by century. They became less substantial, more shadowy, more transparent. They began to see the wraith world, that dim and terrible realm that exists alongside the world of the living, but is normally invisible to mortal eyes. They became aware of Sauron's presence, felt his will pressing against their own, felt the chains of the rings tightening around their souls, and they were unable to resist. One by one, the 9 lords passed out of the world of the living and into the world of shadows. One by one, they became wraiths, creatures never alive nor dead, bound forever to the will of Sauron and the power of the One Ring. One by one, they became the Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, the 9 Riders, the most terrible servants of the Dark Lord. They lost their names, their identities, everything that had made them who they were. They became extensions of Sauron's will, instruments of his malice, weapons that he could wield against his enemies with devastating effect. Only one of the 9 retained even a memory of what he had once been. The Witch King of Mar, greatest of the Nazgul, Lord of the 9, was said to have been a king of Menor in ages past, a sorcerer of terrible power who had sought to rival Sauron himself, before falling under the domination of the ring. He alone among the nine seemed to possess some remnant of independent will, some shadow of the ambition that had driven him life. But even he was utterly subservient to the will of the Dark Lord, incapable of true independence, bound by chains stronger than the iron. This, then, was the fate of the 9 lords who accepted Sauron's gifts. They gained immortality, yes, but it was an immortality of slavery, endless servitude to an evil will, of existence without joy or hope or love. They became terrible, yes, but their terror was not their own. It was merely a reflection of their master's power. They lost everything that had made them human. Everything had made them worthy of the power they once possessed, and they became empty husks, shadows of shadows, servants of the shadow. Let the fate of the 9 be a warning to all who think to gain power through dark bargains. There is always a price, and the price is often higher than we can imagine. But the story of the rings of power does not end with the corruption of the 9, or the ruin of the dwarves, for there remain the 3, the rings of the elves, and these had a different destiny. The 3 rings were preserved by the wisdom of those who bore them. Galadriel kept Nenhin in Lothlorien, using its power to preserve that golden wood against the ravages of time, to maintain a fragment of the ancient beauty of the days in a world that ground dark and diminished. Siúdin kept Narnia safe in the grey heavens, though in time he would pass it to one who he deemed more worthy of its power. And Vilya, the mightiest of the 3, was kept by Gil-galad until his death, and then passed to Elrond, who used it to maintain Rivendell as a haven of peace and learning. These 3 rings were never touched directly by Sauron's hand, and the bearers were wise enough never to use them, while the one ring existed. For though the 3 were the most resistant to Sauron's domination, they were still connected to the one through the very nature of their making. If Sauron had recovered the One Ring and wielded it in its full power, even the 3 would have been subject to his will, and the bearers would have been betrayed. So the elves kept the 3 hidden and unused throughout the long years of Sauron's first reign, and the beauty they might have preserved faded with the passing of time. But let me now tell you of the greater conflict that followed the making of the rings. Sauron's first realm in Mordor grew in power throughout the latter half of the Second Age. He recovered what he could of the rings of power, gathered armies of orcs and men and other fell creatures, and extended his influence across the east and south of Middle-earth. Many kingdoms of men fell under his sway, either through conquest or corruption, and the shadow of Mordor stretched ever longer across the lands of the west. The Inhumanreans, who had saved the elves from destruction in the war of the elves and Sauron, were themselves becoming corrupt. The gift of long life that had been given them bred not gratitude but resentment, for they saw that the elves were truly immortal while they, despite their extended years, still died in the end. They began to fear death, to hate it, to seek ways to escape it. And this fear made them vulnerable to the whispers of Sauron. I shall not tell the full tale of Menasfall tonight, for that is a story for another evening. But know that Sauron himself was taken as a captive to Menna, and there, through cunning and deceit, he corrupted the hearts of its people and turned them against the Valar themselves. He convinced them to worship Morgoth, to practice human sacrifice, to send a great fleet against the Undying lands in a mad attempt to seize immortality by force. The Valar called upon El-Vatar, and El-Vatar answered. Menor was drowned beneath the waves. The great fleet was destroyed, and the shape of the world was changed forever. The Undying lands were removed from the circles of the world, placed beyond the reach of mortal vessels, accessible only to the elves upon their grey ships. Sauron's body was destroyed in the drowning of Menna, but his spirit endured. He had bound too much of himself to the One Ring to be truly killed while it existed. He fled back to Mordor, a spirit of malice and hatred, and there he slowly rebuilt his power. But he had made an error. Some of the faithful of Andrew Manor, those who had remained true to the Valar even when their kings turned to darkness, had escaped the drowning. Led by Elendil the Tall and his sons Isildur and Anrian, they came to Middle-earth and established the kingdoms of Arnor and Northland and Gondor in the south. These kingdoms were strong and proud, allies of the elves who remained in Middle-earth, and they stood against the renewed power of Sauron. The last alliance of elves was formed in the year 340-30 of the Second Age. Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor, and Anan, High King of the Didi-Nadain, led their hosts against Mordor in the greatest military campaign since the War of Wrath. They fought their way across Middle-earth, defeated Sauron's armies in the Battle of Dagorlad, and laid siege to Barad-dûr itself. For 7 years, the siege continued. The forces of the Alliance surrounded the Dark Tower, cutting off supplies and reinforcements, slowly strangling Sauron's power. Many fell during those long years of siege, including Anrian, Elendil's younger son, who was slain by a stone cast from the walls of Barad-dûr. At last, in the year 3441 of the Second Age, Sauron himself came forth to do battle. He was terrible to behold, the Dark Lord in the fullness of his power, clad in black armor that seemed to drink in light, wielding weapons of terrible might. The One Ring gleamed upon his finger, and through it he could direct the full force of his will against his enemies. Gil-galad and Elendil faced him together, the High King of the Elves and the High King of Men standing side by side against the shadow. The battle was fierce beyond telling. Gil-galad bore the spear Aeglos, which no armor could withstand. Elendil bore Narsil, the sword of the sun and moon, forged by the greatest smith of Nogrod in the First Age. Against them, Sauron wielded powers that had been ancient when the world was young. Both Gil-galad and Elendil fell in that battle. The last High King of the Noldor in Middle-earth was slain, and with him ended the great tradition of Noldorin kingship that stretched back to Finn himself. Elendil too was broken, his body shattered, Narsil shattered beneath him. But in his death, Elendil accomplished what he could not have done in life. Sauron was momentarily weakened, his defenses lowered, and Isildur, Elendil's surviving son, took up the hilt shard of Narsil and cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand. The Dark Lord fell. Without the ring, the greater part of Sauron's power was lost to him. His physical form was destroyed, his spirit cast out into darkness, too weak to take shape again for many long years. The soul bound to the One Ring were scattered and diminished, driven into the shadows to wait for their master's return. The Dark Tower of Barad-dûr was cast down, its foundations broken, and the realm of Mordor lay in ruins. The Second Age ended, and the Third Age began, and it seemed that the threat of Sauron was ended forever. But Isildur kept the ring. This was his great error, his tragic mistake, the moment upon which so much of the subsequent history of Middle-earth would turn. Elrond and Ciaran were both present at the end of the battle. They urged Isildur to cast the ring into the fires of Old Ruin, where it had been forged, and where alone it could be destroyed. They told him that while the ring endured, Sauron's spirit could not be truly defeated, that the Dark Lord would eventually return, that the only way to ensure lasting victory was to unmake the source of Sauron's power. But Isildur refused. He claimed the ring as a wergild for his father and brother, a blood price for the deaths of Elendil and Anrian. He looked upon it and saw only its beauty, its power, its allure. He did not see the shadow within, did not perceive the influence that was already beginning to work upon his mind. And so the One Ring passed into the possession of men, and with it passed the best chance the free peoples of Middle-earth would ever have to end the threat of Sauron once and for all. Isildur did not keep the ring for long. Within 2 years of the battle, he was dead. He was travelling north to his kingdom of Arna, when his party was ambushed by Wart near the Gladden fields. Isildur tried to escape by putting on the ring and becoming invisible, but the ring betrayed him. Perhaps it slipped from his finger deliberately, as rings of power were known to do when it served their purposes. Perhaps it simply chose that moment to reveal itself to the oars. Whatever the cause, Isildur became visible again just as he was swimming across the Anduin River, and the orcs shot him full of arrows. His body sank into the river, and the ring sank with him. For more than 2,000 years, the One Ring lay hidden in the mud of the riverbed. It passed out of all knowledge, forgotten by elves and men alike. The world changed around it. Kingdoms rose and fell. Wars were fought and forgotten. Generations were born and died, never knowing that the greatest weapon of the enemy lay asleep beneath the waters of the Anduin. During those long years, Sauron slowly recovered his strength. His spirit could not be destroyed while the ring endured, and so he lingered, a shadow of malice, gradually rebuilding his power. Around the year 1000 of the Third Age, he returned to Middle-earth in a weakened form, establishing himself in the southern reaches of the Green Wood, which became known as Mirkwood because of the shadow that fell upon it. He hid his identity at first, calling himself the Necromancer, for he had not yet regained enough strength to challenge the Free Peoples openly. But he sent out his servants to search for the ring, knowing that if he could recover it, his power would be restored, and he would be greater than he had been before. The Nosgel, too, began to stir. They had been scattered and diminished by the destruction of Sauron's physical form, but they had not been destroyed. They were bound to the One Ring, and while it existed, they existed. Slowly, over the centuries, they reformed, regained their terrible powers, and began once again to serve the will of their master. But the ring was not found. And then, in the year 1263 of the Third Age, something unexpected happened. 2 hobbits were fishing in the Gladden fields, a cousin named Duergol and his friend Smaugol. The boat drifted over the place where Isildur had fallen, and Duergol, diving into the water to retrieve something, found a ring lying in the mud. The ring had been waiting. For 2,500 years, it had lain hidden, biding its time, and now it saw its opportunity. It awakened from its long sleep and reached out with all its seductive power toward the simple mind of a simple hobbit. Duergol was enchanted by the ring's beauty. He held it up in the light, watched it gleam, felt its weight in his hand, and to Smaugol, seeing what his cousin had found, felt a sudden terrible desire. He wanted it. He needed it. It was his birthday, was it not? He deserved a present. The ring should be his. What followed was the first murder committed the One Ring in many ages. Smaugol strangled Duergol with his own hands, took the ring from his dead cousin's grasp, and fled into the darkness. This was the beginning of a transformation more terrible than any that had come before. For Smaugol was not a great lord or a powerful sorcerer. He had no wealth to lose, no kingdom to ruin, no legacy to corrupt. He was simply a small creature alone in the world, with nothing but the ring to keep him company. And the ring consumed him. It stretched his life beyond any natural span, but not in the way it had stretched the lives of the 9 lords. Smaugol did become a wraith, for the ring needed him visible and active in order to use him for its purposes. Instead, he became something else, something twisted and corrupted, and utterly dependent on the ring. He forgot his name, forgot his people, forgot everything except his precious ring. He called it his birthday present, his precious, his love. He retreated from the light of the sun and the company of other beings, hiding in the roots of the misty mountains, living on raw fish and the occasional unwary goblin. He became Gollum, named for the sound he made in his throat, a creature of darkness and misery and obsession. For nearly 500 years, Gollum the Ring, He used it to hunt, to hide, to spy on the goblins who lived in the deeper tunnels. But he never mastered it, never understood its true power or its true nature. He was simply its prisoner, trapped by his own desire, unable to let go of the thing that was destroying him. And then, in the year 2941 of the Third Age, the ring decided it was time to move on. Bilbo Baggins, a respectable hobbit of the Shire who had somehow gotten mixed up in an adventure involving dwarves and a dragon, found him solace in the tunnels beneath the misty mountains. There, in the darkness, he encountered Gollum and played a game of riddles with him. And there, in the darkness, he found the ring. It was not chance that brought Bilbo to that place at that time. The ring had been working, had been guiding events toward this moment. It wanted to be found. It wanted to escape from the darkness beneath the mountains and return to the world where it could work its will. It chose Bilbo. For reasons that remain mysterious, perhaps because hobbits had proven resistant to its corruption in ways that other races had not. Bilbo claimed the ring, used it to escape from Gollum, and carried it out of the mountains and into the wider world. He used it sparingly over the years that followed, mostly for small tricks and to avoid unwanted visitors. He did not understand what it was, did not know its history or its power. To him, it was simply a magic ring, useful for becoming invisible, a curious memento of his adventure. But the ring was working on him nonetheless. It was extending his life, keeping young and vital far beyond the normal span of hobbits. And it was calling to its master, sending out signals that would eventually draw the attention of Sauron and his servants. For Sauron had returned. In the year 51, just 10 years after Bilbo's adventure, the Dark Lord declared himself openly once more. He abandoned his guise as the necromancer and returned to Mordor, where he began rebuilding his power and gathering his forces. The great tower of Barad-dûr rose again from its ruins. The orcs and trolls and other servants of evil flocked to his banner. The Nine Riders were sent forth once more, searching for the ring that had been lost so long ago. And now they had a new lead to follow, a name whispered by a torture in the dungeons of Mordor. Baggins. Shire. Gollum had been captured. He had been tortured. He had revealed everything he knew about the one who had stolen his precious. And now Sauron knew the thing was in the hands of a hobbit, somewhere in a land called the Shire. But here the story takes a turn that Sauron did not expect. Bilbo, you see, had decided to give up the ring. This was extraordinary. In all the history of the Rings of Power, no bear had ever voluntarily relinquished their ring. The Nine had held theirs until they became wraiths. The dwarves had kept theirs until death or disaster took them. Even Isildur, who had held the One Ring for only 2 years, had refused to destroy it when he had a chance. But Bilbo, at the end of his long life, feeling stretched and thin, like butter scraped over too much bread, decided to let it go. He was going away, leaving the Shire, going to live out his remaining years among the elves in Rivendell. And he was going to leave everything behind, including the... It was not easy. When the moment came, Bilbo found himself unable to part with his precious. He made excuses, changed his mind, grew angry when my friend Gandalf pressed him on the matter. The ring's hold on him was stronger than he had realized, stronger than he had ever suspected. But in the end, with Gandalf's help, Bilbo found the strength to let go. He left the ring in an envelope on his mantelpiece, walked out of Bag End and never touched it again. This was a victory, though we did not fully understand it at the time. For the first time in the long history of the Rings of Power, a bear had chosen to give up their ring voluntarily. It showed that the power of the ring, however great, was not absolute. It showed that the will of a simple hobbit could resist the seduction that had claimed kings and lords and powerful sorcerers. It showed that there was hope, and the ring passed to Frodo. Frodo Baggins, Bilbo's young cousin and adopted heir, received the ring along with all of Bilbo's other possessions. He did not know what it was, had no idea of its significance. To him, it was simply a curious heirloom, a magic ring that his uncle had found on his adventure and now passed on to his heir. For 17 years, Frodo kept the ring in the Shire, using it only rarely, not understanding the danger he was in. During those years, Gandalf researched the ring's history, piecing together the clues that would eventually reveal its true nature. And the shadow grew in the east, as Sauron's power and his search for the ring intensified. At last, Gandalf became certain of what Frodo possessed. He tested the ring in the fire of Frodo's hearth and saw the letters of flame appear upon its surface. He read the inscription, the words of the black speech that spoke the ring's true nature and true purpose. One ring, to rule them all, one ring to find. One ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. Frodo had to leave. The ring had to be taken out of the Shire, away from the peaceful lands that had sheltered it for so long. The enemy was searching, his servants were drawing near, and the 9 riders themselves were on their way to find the hobbit who possessed the most dangerous artifact in Middle-earth. What followed was a journey that would take Frodo from the Comp of Bag End to the very slopes of Mount Doom, from the green hills of the Shire to the black land of Mordor. It was a journey that would test him in ways he could never have imagined, that would bring him to the edge of despair and beyond, that would cost him everything he had and more. But that is a story, you know, is it not? The tale of the ring-bearer and his loyal Sam, of the fellowship that formed to protect them, of the long road that led at last to the cracks of doom. You have heard how Frodo carried the ring through Moria and Elrien, how the fellowship was broken at Amon Hen, how Frodo and Sam went on alone toward the Blackland. Let me instead tell you of the 3, and what they did during those final days of the Third Age. The 3 rings of the elves had lain dormant throughout the long centuries of Sauron's exile. Their bearers knew that while one ring existed, the 3 could be used against them. Sauron's will could reach through the connection that bound all the rings of power together, and if the 3 were used while the 1 was in Sauron's possession, their bearers would be revealed and their realms laid open to corruption. But the 3 were not entirely idle. They preserved what they touched, maintained the lands they guarded against the slow decay of time. Rivendell remained a haven of peace and learning, shielded by the power of Vilya. Lothlorien kept its golden beauty, protected by the power of Nenya. And Narya, the Ring of Fire, which Radon had passed to Gandalf when he first arrived in Middle-earth, kindled the hearts of those who faced the darkness with hope and courage. I wore Narya, you see. I, whom you call Gandalf, who was sent to Middle-earth long ago to pose the darkness and strengthen those who fought against it. Dan gave me the ring when I first stepped off the ship at the Grey Havens, saying that I would have need of it in the great labors that lay ahead, and though I rarely spoke of it or showed it to others, I drew upon its power many times during my long years of wandering. Narya was not a ring of direct power, not a weapon that could be used against enemies in battle. Its gift was inspiration, the kindling of hearts, the stirring of hope in those who might otherwise despair. When I spoke words of encouragement to the peoples of Middle-earth, when I rallied the weak and strengthened the failing, when I helped others find the courage to face darkness that seemed overwhelming, it was Narya's power that flowed through me. And in the end, the 3 served their purpose one final time. When Frodo stood at the cracks of doom, at the very place where the One Ring had been forged, he could not do what he had come to do. The ring had worked upon him throughout his long journey, had burrowed into his mind and his will, had claimed him at last as it had claimed so many others before. At the final moment, in the heart of the fire where the ring had been destroyed. Frodo put it on and claimed it as his own. But Gollum was there. Gollum, who had followed Frodo all the way from the borders of Mordor, who had been bound by an oath on the ring and had broken that oath, who'd been waiting for his chance to reclaim his precious. He attacked Frodo, bit off his finger, and took the ring for himself. And in his moment of triumph, Gollum fell, whether he stumbled, or was pushed by some force beyond mortal understanding, or whether the very foundations of Mount Doom shifted beneath him, no one can say for certain. But Gollum, clutching the ring he had sought for so long, tumbled over the edge of the precipice and plunged into the fires below. The ring was destroyed. In an instant, all of Sauron's power collapsed. The Dark Lord had bound too much of himself to the ring, had made it the foundation of his power, and when it was unmade, he was amazed with it. His spirit was cast out into the void, too diminished to ever take form again. The Nazgul, bound to the ring's existence, perished utterly. The Dark Tower of Barad fell, never to rise again. The armies of Mordor were thrown into chaos and defeated. But the destruction of the One Ring had consequences beyond the defeat of Sauron. The three rings lost their power. From the moment the One Ring was unmade, the three began to fade. The connection that had bound all the rings of power together was severed, and without that connection, the three could not function. Rivendell began to diminish. The golden beauty of Lothlorien started to fade. Even the warmth of Narya grew cold upon my finger. The age of the Rings of Power was over. This was the choice that the elves had made, so long ago in the depths of the Second Age. They had used the knowledge Sauron taught them to make the three, to create tools that would help them preserve what they loved against the ravages of time. But in doing so, they had bound themselves to a fate that was not entirely their own. The three were connected to the One, and the One was an artifact of evil, forged for domination and corrupted from its very beginning. When the One fell, the three fell with it, and without the three, there was nothing left to hold back the fading of the elves in Middle-earth. The long diminishment that they had fought against for so many ages could no longer be resisted. The time had come for the Elder to leave Middle-earth forever. Galadriel, who had worn Nenya for thousands of years, sailed into the west with Elrond and with Gandalf himself. She passed over the sea to the Undying Lands, there to find peace and healing after her long ages of labor. Elrond went with her, leaving behind the realm of Endil that he had built and maintained for so long. And I went too, though that is a tale for another time. Only Círdan remained of those who had borne the three. Círdan, who had given Narya to me so many years before, stayed at the Grey Havens, building ships to carry the last of the elves into the west. He is there still, I suppose, or was when last I had news of Middle-earth, faithfully fulfilling the task he had taken upon himself in ages long past. So ends the tale of the Rings of Power. What lessons can we draw from this long and sorrowful history? What wisdom is there in the story of the forging, and the finding and the ultimate destruction of these artifacts that shaped the fate of Middle-earth for so many ages? First, perhaps, we might consider the nature of power itself. The Rings of Power offered great gifts to those who bore them: long life, enhanced abilities, the power to preserve what was beloved against the ravages of time. These were not small things. These were gifts that any mortal might dream of, and that the elves themselves had sought throughout their long existence. But power always comes with a price. The dwarves who wore the seven gained wealth beyond imagining, but that wealth bred a greed that attracted the attention of dragons and brought ruin upon their kingdoms. The men who wore the gained immortality, but it was an immortality of slavery, of endless servitude to a dark will. Even the elves who bore the three found that their power was bound to a source of evil, but that their works of preservation were dependent upon the continued existence of an artifact forged for domination and conquest. There is no power without consequence. Every gift carries within it the seed of its own corruption. To seek power is to risk being consumed by the very thing you sought to control. Second, we might consider the nature of resistance. Sauron's plan was to dominate all the peoples of Middle-earth through the rings of power. He nearly succeeded. The Nine Lords became his utterly devoted servants. The dwarves were diminished and their kingdoms destroyed. The elves were forced to hide their greatest treasures and watch their realms fade. But he did not succeed completely. The elves perceived his treachery and hid the three before he could use them against their bearers. The dwarves, though they could not escape the ring's influence, were too stubborn to be enslaved directly, and the hobbits proved remarkably resistant to the corruption of the One Ring itself. Bilbo gave it up voluntarily, something no other bearer had ever done. Frodo carried it all the way to Mount Doom, resisting its seduction for far longer than any lord or wizard could have managed. Sam, who bore the ring for a time when Frodo was captured by orcs, found that its temptations held little appeal for a hobbit whose greatest desire was simply to tend a garden. The humble, it seems, are often stronger than the mighty. Those who do not seek power are less vulnerable to its corruption. Those whose desires are simple and good cannot easily be seduced by promises of dominion and control. Third, we might consider the nature of hope. The story of the Rings of Power is, in many ways, a dark tale. It is a story of corruption and betrayal, of good intentions twisted toward evil ends, of the slow grinding down of everything beautiful and noble in the world. From the very beginning, the shadow of Sauron hung over the making of the rings. Even the three, the fairest and most pure, were bound to his will through the connection of their making. And yet the story ends not in darkness but in light. The ring was destroyed. Sauron was defeated. The free peoples of Middle-earth survived to build a new world, one free of the shadow that had hung over them for so long. The cost was high, terribly high, but the victory was real. And that victory was won not by the wise or the powerful, but by the small and the overlooked. A hobbit carried the ring to Mount Doom. A creature twisted by centuries of corruption played the final role in its destruction. The great lords and mighty wizards contributed to the victory. Yes, but in the end, it came down to Frodo and Sam and Gollum, three small beings at the edge of a volcano, playing out a drama that would determine the fate of the world. There is hope in that, I think. Hope for all of us who feel small and powerless against the darkness. Hope that even when all seems lost, when the shadow seems overwhelming, when we feel that there is nothing we can do to make a difference, somehow, in ways we cannot foresee, our actions might matter. The ring is gone now, the three are powerless. The age of the Rings of Power has passed into history, into legend, into the dim remembrance of those few who lived through it, and the stories told by those who came after. But the lessons are in: power corrupts, resistance is possible, hope endures, and in the end, perhaps it is not the great and the mighty who determine the fate of the world, but the small and the humble, the overlooked and the underestimated, those whose hearts are good and whose desires are simple. The fire burns low now, and the hour grows late. Outside, the night is deep, and the stars are bright, and somewhere far in the west, the sun waits to rise and begin a new day. The world goes on, as it always has, and the stories of ages past become the foundation upon which the present is built. I have told you of the Rings of Power. I have told you of their making and their marrying, of the lords who bore them, and the fate that befell them, of the long war waged for their possession, and the final victory won through their destruction. It is a tale of sorrow, of darkness and of light, of the endless struggle between good and evil that has shaped the history of Middle Earth since the very beginning. But perhaps the most important thing to remember is this. The rings are gone. Their power has faded. The chains they forged have been broken. And though the world they left behind is diminished, is sadder, is less magical than it was in the elder days, it is also free. Free of the shadow of Sauron. Free of the corruption of the rings. Free to make its own choices, to forge its own future, to build something new upon the ashes of the old. That is the gift the destruction of the ring gave to Middle-earth. Not power, but freedom. Not dominion, but the chance to choose one's own path. Not immortality, but the chance to live, truly live, without the weight of ancient evil pressing down upon every moment. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is more than enough. Perhaps that is everything. Let me speak now of the individual rings themselves, for each had its own character and its own history, and the tale would be incomplete without some account of their individual fates. The 7 rings of the dwarves were, as I have said, resistant to Sauron's domination in ways that the other rings were not. This was due in part to the nature of dwarves themselves, who had been created by all to endure the domination of Morgoth, and were thus uniquely resilient to the influence of evil. But it was also due to the nature of the rings themselves, which were attuned to the desires and capabilities of their bearers. The 7 enhanced what the dwarves already possessed. They made the dwarf lords richer, more skilled, more able to find the treasures hidden in the earth. They did not grant invisibility or long life in the manner of the other rings, for dwarves did not need or desire such gifts. They simply made the dwarves more dwarvish, if you understand my meaning, amplifying their natural talents to extraordinary degrees. But this amplification came at a price. The greed that the rings kindled was not a new thing, not something foreign to dwarvish nature. It was simply an intensification of something that already existed, a magnification of a flaw that had always been present. The rings took the natural desire for gold and gems and beautiful things that all dwarves share and turned it into an obsession. A hunger that could never be satisfied, a drive that led the dwarf lords to accumulate wealth beyond any reasonable need or purpose. This wealth attracted dragons. Glorong's children and grandchildren, the great worms of the north, were drawn to the hoards amassed by the ring, bearing dwarves, as if by some irresistible compulsion. One by one, the great dwarf kingdoms fell to dragon fire. The realm of the Grey Mountains was destroyed. The ancient halls of Gumbard were abandoned. The treasures accumulated over centuries were either consumed by dragonish greed or buried beneath ruins that none dared excavate. 4 of the 7 were consumed by dragons. They melted in the terrible heat of dragon flame, their power dissipated, their substance unmade. The other 3 were recovered by Sauron himself during his long return to power in the Third Age. He had captured them, either through direct assault or through the treachery of agents who served him among the peoples of Middle-earth. The last of the 7, the ring borne by the line of Durin, was taken from Thorin in the dungeons of Dol Guldur. Thorin was Thorin Oakenshield's father, and he was captured by Sauron's servants while wandering alone in the wild. He was tortured for years in the pits beneath the Necromancer's fortress, and the ring was taken from him before he died. With that ring's capture, the 7 passed out of the possession of the dwarves forever. We do not know what Sauron did with the 3 he recovered. He may have melted them down, extracted whatever power he could from them, and added it to his own. He may have hidden them away, waiting for a moment when they might be useful to his plans. He may simply have hoarded them, as he hoarded all things of power, out of a possessive malice that could not bear to see anything of value in the hands of others. Whatever their fate, the 7 are gone now. Gone like so much else that was made in the elder days, lost to the long ages of the world. They were not as important as the 9 or the 3 perhaps, but they played their part in the history of Middle-earth, and their loss diminished the dwarves in ways that still echo through the ages. The 9 rings, of course, had a far more terrible fate. The 9 were given to great lords of men, as I have said, kings and warriors and sorcerers of renown. We do not know all of their names, for the process of their corruption stripped away their identities along with their humanity. But we know that 3 of them were said to be lords of Endi Menna, great captains who accepted Sauron's gifts during the dark years before the downfall. One was said to be a king of the Easterlings, a ruler of vast realms in the lands beyond the Sea of Ron. Others came from the south, from Harad and beyond, from peoples who had never known the friendship of the elves or the light of the west. Each of these lords was corrupted by degrees. The rings granted them long life, yes, and power over others, and the ability to see things hidden from mortal sight. But with these gifts came a slow transformation, a gradual fading from the world of the living into a twilight realm of shadows and servitude. The process took centuries. It was not a sudden change, not a dramatic transformation from living man to deathless wraith. It was a slow erosion, a wearing away of everything that made them human, until nothing remained but their hunger for the ring and their service to its master. They lost their names first, I think. Names are powerful things, anchors that tie us to our identities and our histories. As the ring bearers faded, their names became meaningless to them, sounds without significance, labels for beings that no longer existed. They became the 9, the Nazgul, the ringwraiths identified only by their number nature. They lost their bodies next. Not entirely, not all at once, but gradually, as their physical forms became less substantial and their spiritual forms became more dominant. They could still interact with the physical world when they chose, could still ride horses and wield swords and speak what could be heard by mortal ears. But they were no longer bound to their bodies as living beings are bound. They could be hurt, yes, but not killed, not in a dreamt way. They could be driven back, scattered, forced to flee, but they always returned, always reformed, always came back to serve their master. They lost their wills last. This was the most complete loss, the final surrender of everything that had once made them individuals. The 9 became extensions of Sauron's will, instruments his malice, weapons that he could wield against his enemies. They had no desires of their own except the desire to serve. They had no goals except the goals the master set for them. They were slaves in the most complete sense of the word, utterly dependent on Sauron's will for every aspect of their existence. Only the Witch King retained some semblance of independent will, and even that was more shadow than substance. He was the greatest of the 9, the Lord of the Nazgul, and some spark of his original ambition seemed to survive his transformation. He established his own kingdom in Angmar, waged his own wars against the Didi Nidain of the north, pursued his own vendetta against the line of the kings of Gondor. But even his seeming independence was an illusion. Everything did served Sauron's purposes. Every victory he won advanced his master's plans. He was not a rival but a lieutenant, not an ally but a servant. The Witch King fell at last before the walls of Minas Tirith, slain by Dawn Owen Rohan and the hobbit Merry, who bore a blade from the barrow, downs that had been made to fight against Angmar in ages past. It was a strange fate for the Lord of the Nazgul to be brought down by a woman and a halfling, but perhaps it was fitting. The great and powerful had sought to destroy him for centuries and failed. It took the overlooked and underestimated to bring him to his end. The other 8 Nazgul perished with their master when the ring was destroyed. They had been bound to it too completely, their existence too dependent upon its power, to survive its unmaking. But when the ring fell into the fire, they simply ceased to be, their spirits dissipating like in a strong wind. whatever torment or release awaited them in the afterlife, if such beings can have an afterlife, came upon them in that moment, and they troubled the world no more. So ended the 9 lords who had accepted Sauron's poisoned gifts so many centuries before. The story is a warning against the desire for immortality, against the hunger for power that leads men to make bargains they do not understand with forces they cannot control. They sought to cheat death and found, instead, an existence far worse than death, a slavery that endured for millennia, a diminishment that stripped away everything that had made them worthy of their original power. Let their fate be a lesson to all who would seek to extend their lives beyond the span allotted to them by the Creator. Death is a gift as well as an ending, a release as well as a loss. To flee from it too desperately is to risk falling into a darkness from which there is no escape. And now let me speak of the 3, the Elven Rings, which I have touched upon but not explored in the depth that they deserve. The 3 were made by Celebrimbor alone, without the direct participation of Sauron, though using the techniques that Sauron had taught. They were the pinnacle of Elven Ring craft, the most powerful and the pure of all the rings of power. They were not tainted by Sauron's direct touch, and they were made for purposes that were entirely benevolent: the preservation of beauty, the healing of hurts, the resistance against the decay of time. Narya, the Ring of Fire, was set with a great ruby that glowed with an inner light. Its power was to inspire and to encourage, to kindle hope in hearts that might otherwise despair. It did not grant its bearer the ability to wield fire as a weapon, as some have supposed. It was not a ring of destruction but a creation, not a ring of war but of peace. Its fire was the fire of the hearth, not the fire of the forge or the battlefield. Sihirand the shipwright received Narya first, and he bore it for many years in the grey heavens. But when I came to Middle-earth, sent by the Valar to oppose the darkness that was rising in the east, Sihirand gave the ring to me. He saw what I was, I think, saw past the old grey form I wore to the spirit that lay beneath. And he knew that I would have greater need of Narya's power in the years to come than he would, sitting in his haven by the sea building ships to carry the elves into the west. I wore Narya throughout my long years in Middle-earth. I drew upon its power when I faced the Balrog in the depths of Moria, when I stood against Sauron's forces at the Battle of 5 Armies, when I rallied the defenders of Helm's Deep and Minas Tirith. It was not the source of my power, for I had power of my own, power granted to me by the Valar when they sent me into the world, but it amplified that power, focused it, made it more effective. It helped me to help others, which was always my purpose. Nenga, the Ring of Water, was made of mithril and set with a white stone that gleamed like starlight. Its power was to preserve and to protect, to shield the land from the ravages of time and the malice of enemies. It was the ring most suited to the elves' purposes, for it embodied everything they had hoped to achieve through the making the rings of power: the ability to hold back change, to maintain what was beloved, to keep the world young and fair. Galadriel received Nenya early in its history, and she bore it throughout all the long years of the Second and Third Ages. With its power, she maintained Lothlorien as a refuge of elven beauty in a world that was growing dark and diminished. The golden wood was preserved against the decay that claimed other elven realms. The light of the elder days lingered there when it had faded elsewhere. Visitors to Lothlorien often felt as if they had stepped into another age, a time before the shadow fell upon Middle-earth. But even Nenya's power had its limits. It could preserve what existed, but could not create what had been lost. It could slow the fading, not reverse it entirely. And it was bound to the one ring, as all the rings of power were bound, and while the one existed, Nenya could be used against its bearer if Sauron ever recovered his greatest treasure. Galadriel knew this, She knew that her realm existed on borrowed time, that the preservation she achieved through Nenya's power was temporary at best. She looked forward with hope to the destruction of the One Ring. Even knowing that such destruction would mean the end of her own power and the fading of everything she had worked so hard to preserve. She chose freedom over permanence, even at so great a cost. Villa the Ring of Air was the mightiest of the three. It was made of golden set with a great sapphire that blazed with blue fire. Its power was the most versatile and the least defined, for air is everywhere and touches everything. It could heal and it could preserve, but it could also reveal and conceal, could calm storms and raise them, could do many things that the other rings could not. Galad bore Vilya for most of its early history, using its power to maintain his kingdom of Linden in the face of Sauron's rising threat. But when he fell in the War of the Last Alliance, he gave the ring to Eren, his herald and kinsman, and Eren bore it throughout the Third Age. With Vilya's power, Eren maintained Rivendell as a haven of peace and learning. The last homely house was protected against the darkness that surrounded it on all sides. Travelers who found their way, they discovered a place of rest and healing, a refuge where they could recover from wounds, both physical and spiritual. Many of the great events of the Third Age were planned at Rivendell. Many of the great heroes found shelter there, and all of this was possible because of the protection that Vilya provided. Eren was also a great healer, perhaps the greatest in Middle-earth during his time, and Vilya's power enhanced his natural abilities. He could cure illnesses that defeated lesser healers, could mend wounds that should have been fatal, could bring those at the edge of death back to life. Frodo was healed in Rivendell after being stabbed by the Morgul blade, a wound that would have been mortal without Eren's skill and Vilya's power. But like the other two elven rings, Vilya's power to an end when the One Ring was destroyed. The connection that bound the three to the One was severed, and without the connection, the three could not function. Rivendell began to fade, its protections weakening, its beauty diminishing. Eren knew that his time in Middle-earth was ending, and when the last ship sailed from the Grey Havens, he was aboard it, carrying Vilya to the Undying Lands where, perhaps it might recover some measure of its former power. So the three passed out of Middle-earth, carried by their bearers to the west. They were not destroyed, as the One was destroyed, but they were diminished beyond recovery, their power too bound to the fate of the One Ring to survive its unmaking. Perhaps in Valinor, in the blessed realm where the power of the Valar still holds sway, they might regain some of what they lost. But in Middle-earth their work is done, their story is ended, and the age they represented has passed into memory. And so we come to the end of the tale of the Rings of Power. It is a tale of ambition and corruption, of hope and despair, of the endless struggle between good and evil that has shaped the history of Middle-earth since the very beginning. It is a tale of great heroes and terrible villains, of choices made and consequences faced, of the price that must be paid for power and the cost of resisting it. But more than anything else, it is a tale of ordinary folk doing extraordinary things. The Rings of Power were made by the greatest smiths in history, born lords and kings, and wizards of enormous power. The wars fought over them involved armies that stretched from horizon to horizon, battles that shaped the fate of nations and the course of history. Great names fill this tale: Sauron and Celebrimbor, Gil-galad and Elendil, Galadriel and Elrond and Gandalf. But in the end, it was not the great and powerful who determined the outcome. It was Bilbo, a comfortable hobbit of the Shire who had never sought adventure or power or glory, who first broke the ring's hold by giving it up voluntarily. It was Frodo, his heir, who carried the ring to Mount Doom through dangers that would have broken any other bearer. It was Sam, a simple gardener whose greatest ambition was to grow the best potatoes in the Shire, who kept Frodo going when all hope seemed lost. And it was Gollum, a twisted creature destroyed by his own obsession, who played the final role in the ring's destruction. The humble overcame what the mighty could not. The overlooked accomplished what the powerful failed to achieve. The small and the simple saved the world from a darkness that the wise and the strong could not have resisted. There is comfort in that, I think. Comfort for all of us who feel small and powerless in the face of the great evils of the world. Comfort for those who wonder if their choices matter, if their actions can make any difference, if anything they do can change the course of events. They can. They do. They matter more than we can know. The fire has burned very low now. The coals glow softly in the darkness, and the shadows have grown long upon the walls. Outside, the night is deep and peaceful, and the stars wheel slowly overhead in their endless dance across the sky. I have spoken for many hours tonight. My voice grows weary, and my thoughts begin to drift toward rest. The tale of the rings of power is long and complex, and I have told it as best I can, but there is always more that could be said, always details that could be added, always depths that could be explored. Perhaps another night, perhaps another telling. For now let the story rest as you should rest, as I shall rest when the last embers fade, and the dawn begins to brighten the eastern sky. The rings are gone, their power has passed, the age they shaped has ended, and a new age has begun. The world that remains is smaller than it was, simpler, less magical, but it is also freer, free of the shadow of Sauron, free of the corruption of the rings, free to make its own way, to find its own path, to become whatever its people choose to make of it. That freedom is the gift the destruction of the ring gave to Middle-earth. Not power, but the absence of power. Not dominion, but liberty. Not immortality, but the chance to live and die as free beings, making choices that matter, building lives that have meaning. And perhaps it is the greatest gift of all. Sleep now, dear friend. Let my words settle into your memory like snow falling softly on a winter field. Let the tale of the rings of power become part of who you are, a story you carry with you through all the days of your life. Remember the danger of power. Remember the importance of resistance. Remember that hope endures even in the darkest times, and that the smallest person can change the course of history. And remember that you are not alone. You are part of a great story, a story that began before you were born and will continue long after you are gone. Your choices matter. Your actions have consequences. Your life has meaning beyond what you can see or imagine. The rings of power are destroyed, but the stories they left behind remain. And stories, like light, can never truly die. They pass from teller to listener, from generation to generation, carrying wisdom and warning and wonder across the long ages of the world. I have passed this story to you tonight. Guard it well, share it wisely, and let it remind you always that even in the midst of great darkness, there is always the possibility of light. The fire is almost out now. The last coals are fading, and the cold of night is beginning to creep into this little room. But you are warm beneath your blankets, warm in your dreams, warm in the knowledge that the world, for all its dangers and sorrows, is not without hope. Sleep well, dear friend. May your dreams be peaceful, and your rest be deep. May you wake to a new day full of promise and possibility. And may the memory of this tale give you strength in the dark times that all of us must face. The rings of power are gone, but the courage of those who opposed them lives on. The wisdom of those who resisted their corruption endures. The love of those sacrificed everything to destroy them remains. And that, perhaps, is the true power. Not the power of rings or weapons or dark lords, but the power of hearts that refuse to give in to despair, of wills that cannot be broken by any force of evil, of spirits that shine with their own light even when all other lights have failed. You have such power within you. Never forget it. Never doubt it. And never let anyone convince you that you are too small or too weak or too unimportant to make a difference. The smallest person can change the course of history. A hobbit destroyed the greatest weapon of the enemy. And you, whoever you are, wherever you are, have within you the same capacity for courage and sacrifice and hope. The tale is told. The night is deep. The fire sleeps, and so should you. Rest now. The rings of power are destroyed, and then the world is free as well. All is as it should be. Sleep. And when you wake, remember that you are part of a great story. A story that continues with every choice you make, every action you take, every moment you live. The rings are gone, but the story goes on, and so do we. Good night, dear friend. Good night. The stars are shining. The world is at peace. And somewhere, in the long memory of Middle-earth, the tale of the rings of power is being told again, passed from generation to generation, a reminder of what was, what might have been, and what still can be. Sleep now. The story will be here when you wake. It will always be here. It will never be forgotten, and neither will you. Good night.